Good morning, everybody. We tended to wait for the Secretary General of FEPS, Laszlo, but he's still not with us, and we cannot risk to skip our schedule because we are very tight and the room is very full. So I'm happy to welcome you here in the European Parliament on our next left lecture, which is already the 7th lecture which we are holding. How progressives should think about migration. And we are happy that Ellen Manning is with us. Welcome, Professor. And you're the main guest here. And also, we are happy to have with us Laszlo Andor. Until now, he looks like my friend Harvey. And also Anja Schurbeck, the Deputy Secretary General of FEPS, and also Birgit Zippel. She's the coordinator of S&D in the Liebe, so in the respective committee of the European Parliament, and also Marit May, from the Dutch delegation. And we are expecting Juan Fernando López Aguilar, who is the Liebe chair, no longer coordinator. AFCO, sorry, yeah. And then we have also with us Pascal Smet from the Brussels Parliament. Hello, Pascal. And Agnes Hubert. Yes, you're also from FEPS, but from the Scientific Council. Happy to have you here. And my name is Andreas SCHIEDER. I'm also a member of the European Parliament, and I have the pleasure to chair this Next Left project, which is a joint venture of the Karl Renner-Institut, which is the Austrian branch of FEPS and FEPS itself. And the lecture title today is How Progressives Should Think About Migration. And introducing Ellen Manning, professor in the London School of Economics and the director of the Labour Programme of the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE, and he former chair of the Britain's Migration Advisory Committee. And his latest book from last year, published, Why Immigration Policy is Hard and How to Make it Better. And I think the day today could not have been chosen better, because everybody is thinking also how this issue, how Britain will continue, and how also concerning this issue we will continue. But the argument which you used in your book is we will always have and need immigration or migration, and to better manage migration is what we need for doing this. We need reliable evidence. And your book tries also to exactly providing this evidence for the key question, including the effects of immigration on jobs, incomes, taxes, public services, and our communities. A lot of issues which were also, let's say, misused 10 years ago or 15 years ago in this long-lasting Brexit debate. And we are also here in the European Parliament in a deep migration discussion. Simply last week, we had a voting in Strasbourg in the plenary, where the extreme right forces of the Parliament, together with the, as they define themselves, moderate conservative forces, voted on a part of the migration package, and thinking that they were still using it as a political symbol, but not, let's say, as a tool of solving problem. Quite contrary. And therefore, this low point of parliamentarism, of shouting crowds, of send them back in the hemicycle is something which is, I think, also have to be addressed. And we as progressives, we need also to address this issue with a focus, I think, on facts. Therefore, I think this lecture is extremely good today, and also with a clear set of values which we have. And the values, I think, sometimes also put into question nowadays, like human dignity, international solidarity, the rule of law, but they could be even more the answers on this issue. So maybe to start, but then to give the floor to you, I see two main questions: is how to make migration policy better, and second question, how to address the underlying issue of voters' anxiety to counter the far-right narratives around immigration and migrants, and how to deal with this issue. So, without losing any further time, we maybe quickly. I can be very quick. Okay, then very short. Quick note, because you were late.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Andy, for introducing the program. I'm sorry for being slightly late, but indeed, it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all, especially our speaker, Professor Alan Manning, but also distinguished members of the European Parliament and further experts. FEPS is incredibly proud to have run the Next Left series for years, and this is a kind of emblematic regular activity of ours, putting on the agenda a number of topics which are important for our political family, its present, but also its future. We do believe that without a very thorough, honest, and explicit assessment of the current situation, it's very difficult to chart the way out of the difficulties of the time. Having our speaker today from the United Kingdom, no need to underline how strongly the topic of the day is connected with the political situation in the UK, to some extent the perpetual political instability, which colleagues have experienced on the other side of the channel in the aftermath of the UK leaving the European Union, which was at least partly driven by the ambivalence, if I can use this word, ambivalence about migration, whether it is EU migration or non-EU migration. That's an issue for the experts. So on behalf of FEPS, I just say that we will also try to take advantage of the entire discussion today and also use it for publicity and further inputs for the discussions in Brussels, but also beyond. Thank you so much, and we also look forward to the presentation and the discussion that follows.
So thank you, Laszlo. And now, Ellen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. As you're about to find out, I have ideas about migration, but I don't pretend to have all the answers. So I'm kind of looking forward to the discussion that we might have. I don't really have to tell you that immigration is one of the most prominent divisive issues in the politics of our countries. It played a big part in Brexit and the rise of reform in the UK, Trump in the US, and basically sort of populist right-wing parties in high-income countries draw much of their support from voters anxious about migration. And how to address these concerns has been a major problem for progressive parties, perhaps the major problem, because they've seen large swathes of traditional voters begin to vote for these right-wing populist parties. So the plan of this lecture is I'm going to try and explain why we are where we are, why I think immigration policy is hard, but why we make it harder than it needs to be, how to make it better. And ultimately, I think we need to get back to a situation where immigration is not a major salient issue in our politics. And I don't think that's impossible, because there have been long periods when it hasn't been. So I'm just going to start with sort of background. This may be very familiar to lots of you, so I'll try to be kind of very brief. So a migrant defined as someone who's living in a country different from where they were born. The share of migrants in the world as a whole, as a share of the world's population, hasn't actually risen that much. It's gone from a bit below 3% to about 3.5% over the past sort of 35 years. But in the high income countries, the rise has been more dramatic. So it's gone from a bit over 7% to over 15%. So it's more than doubled in the last 35 years. Now, that hides a lot of variation within high income countries. I don't know if you can sort of see all of this, but many European countries are now, the share of migrants in their population is between sort of 15 and 25%. And what I think is not always so often realized is that actually the share of migrants in Western European countries is higher than in the United States, which is a country that styles itself as a country of immigrants, although somewhat delusionally in this regard. Now, when people are asked how many migrants do you think there are in your country, what's the share of your country's population that you think are migrant, they almost always, in most countries, overestimate the share of migrants by quite large proportions. I mean, this is not unique to Europe, as you can see here. So they give numbers that would be sort of 30, 35%, when the actual true number is like 15%. They are often also very ill-informed about the mix of migration. They tend to overestimate the numbers of unauthorized migrants. I always use the term unauthorized migrants. Different people, this poll actually used the term legal, illegal migrants, and asylum seekers. So you can see here in a range of European countries that most people think that there are more migrants who are here illegally than legally, and there is no credible estimate that says that that is true. So they get the numbers wrong, they get the mix wrong. But at the same time, there's also a tendency, I think, to underplay the changes that have occurred. So here are two quotes. These are from Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, won Nobel Prize in Economics, who I admire greatly as economists, by Hein de Haas, who's perhaps the leading migration scholar. Again, he's written what I generally think is a very good recent book on migration. And he says, current levels of international migration are neither exceptionally high nor increasing. Now, that is true as a statement about the world as a whole, more or less, but it was really not true as a description of what has been happening in Western European countries. So I think sort of pretending, and, Banerjee and Duflo say, why the panic? The fraction of international migrants in the world is roughly what it was in 1960 or 90. I don't think the typical voter in Europe attracted to vote for a right-wing populist party is going to be very impressed by being told, well, the share of migrants in the Chinese population is 0.1%, and so you shouldn't worry about this at all. And these rises in migration that we've had have, for the most part, not had public consent. So in poll after poll, if people are asked, do you want higher, lower, or about the same level of migration, people, large majorities, often say they want lower migration. And this has been true for a very long time. We have some opinion polls for the US going back 60 years. And in those 60 years, there are only 2 years in which more people have said they want higher migration than lower migration. So for a very long time, people have said they want lower migration, but that isn't what they have got. Now, again, one always needs a bit of nuance. So views of the public are more positive about some types of migration than others. I don't know whether it's easy to read, but typically, if you're over to the right on this graph, that means the public are less favorable about this sort of migrant. So you can see here that people worry about migrants coming to the country to claim benefits. They worry about people entering Europe through irregular means to seek asylum. Those are the sorts of migrants that people worry about. On the other hand, they're really not worried very much at all about people who come as doctors, about people who come as skilled workers, about foreign students. Now, a very simple, perhaps overly simple explanation for our present troubles, why immigration has become so salient, is that there's a gap between what people say they want and what they've got. And that is fundamentally the source of discontent around migration. And so if you want to make immigration go away as an issue, you've got to reduce that gap. And there are basically 2 ways in which you might think about doing this. We're going to try and change what people want to make them more want higher levels of migration, or we're going to change what people get, which is going to mean in terms of lower levels of migration. And it's not surprising that if you think in that way, we end up in kind of quite a binary way of thinking about migration. So a lot of the time, it seems that we've sort of got, when we discuss migration, it's sort of 2 tribes, one pro-migrant and one anti-migrant. And that leads to a very sort of binary style of debate, which I don't think is actually productive at all. So on the pro-migration side, basically, you would have the argument that they want to change what people want, sort of typically arguing there are big economic gains from migration and only ignorance and prejudice, of which there is plenty, a very large amount. So please don't make me think that I'm saying there is none of that. There's a lot of that can explain opposition to the levels of migration that we have or have had. And on the other side, you have the sort of anti-tribe who want to change what people get. basically arguing they've been betrayed by out-of-touch elites, best indifferent to people like them, and at worst are seeking to replace them with migrants who they care about more. And I think that adversarial style of debate serves us really badly. And, you know, when I was on that migration committee in the UK, and you had to talk to a lot of people with a wide range of views, what was very striking to me is that both sides can't really understand why the arguments that they personally find so convincing just don't convince the other side at all. Both sides were very free with their criticisms of the other side, but probably not enough self-criticism, I came to think. Actually, I'm probably guilty of that as well. So I'll put my hands up there. And you end up thinking that the other side are beyond reason. And this is a really bad idea if you want to persuade other people. You've got to go to them on their terms. You can't be a sort of, you know, if you want to convince someone of an argument, you have to find arguments that they find convincing. And in this committee, I came to the conclusion that often both sides, not always, but often, there was a lot of cherry picking, exaggerating, misrepresenting evidence on all sides. And so our debate ends up not only very binary, but very polarized. And again, that wasn't very helpful. So it was like one side saying immigration is good, now it's very good, and the other side saying immigration is bad, no, it's very bad. And it's not the only aspect of our politics where we see polarization, but it's a very prominent one. And just as I give an example of that, around the debate around migration and aging. So all high-income countries face, you know, the challenge of aging populations. And the pro-immigration tribe probably argues that high migration, we need to avoid this. So there's an article here, op-ed from the Financial Times, saying the economic case for migration is clear. Aging populations in the UK and Europe means workforces will shrink. The anti-immigration tribe argue that migration can only prevent aging if it's ever-increasing numbers. So it's essentially a Ponzi scheme. So you can see from an article from a right-wing newspaper in the UK, the immigration Ponzi scheme is about to collapse. Now, what does the evidence say on that? Well, the evidence says that migration can help a bit with aging, but not as much as commonly thought. So the challenge of aging is one powerful reason to have migration, because the alternative in all our countries is already population decline, or certainly in the future. But the impact of migration on aging is actually much bigger in the short run than the longer run. So, and aging is a long run challenge. So it's not a fantastic policy for addressing a long run challenge. And there's a very simple reason for that. So that when migrants first arrive, they might be sort of age around 30. They're making our population younger at that point. But they don't stay 30 forever. Just like everyone else, they become older. And they age at exactly the same rate as everyone else. They're just people, basically. And, you know, any serious, you know, demographic report on this issue, there was quite a good one in 2019 by the EU, basically says, you know, more immigration is not enough to cope with the challenges of population aging. It also said, by the way, that what an idea that is attractive to people on the populist right, that higher fertility is the answer, is that is also not going to be the answer. The simple reason is that how our populations are going to evolve is already baked in by what's happened in past decades, and that's going to determine what's going to happen in the future. So migration is a challenge we're going to face. Migration can help a bit with it, but don't think it's an answer to that particular issue. So what about trying to be a bit less critical and a bit more constructive? So what would I argue is a better way? So first of all, I think that we are going to have immigration, full stop. We are. But we're also going to have controls on immigration. So I don't, you know, completely open borders in the world as a whole is not a realistic policy. It can be a realistic policy like free movement within the EU between countries at similar levels of economic development. For the world as a whole, it's not. So we are going to have controls on immigration. And what do those controls basically mean? They basically mean saying yes to some people who want to come to your country and no to others. So, and, you know, it's really important that we do that in a way that doesn't denigrate either group. So we're not saying no to people because they're bad people. We're saying no to people because there are limits to how many people we can, the levels of immigration we can have. So migration policy inevitably involves selection, choice, who to say yes to, who to say no to. Actually, lots of bits of our life involve selection. You apply for a job, people apply, you say yes to one person, you say no to other people. Again, you're not saying, the people you say no to, you're not saying I'm saying no because you're a terrible, horrible person. You're typically saying they were stronger candidates, I'm sorry. We choose life partners. We say yes to some people, no to other people. There's lots of elements. So migration policy is no different from that. So why is it so hard? And I think the fundamental reason it's hard is that our world is so unequal. So where you live is the most important determinant of your quality of life. And what that means is that there are going to be large numbers of people who want to move from lower to higher income countries like Europe. And the number of people who want to move is far more than are realistically going to be admitted. So we're going to say no to far more people than we're going to say yes to. And that, I think, is fundamentally our situation. Just to illustrate that, of just how extreme the differences in life chances are. So last year, 66,000 people crossed the central Mediterranean from North Africa to Europe. Each of them probably paid more than the business class airfare for that journey. And it's dangerous. So in 2025, I think it was about 1% of those people died. But on the other hand, but in spite of the fact that you've got a 1% chance of dying in the next few hours, your life expectancy almost certainly goes up by getting in the boat and rather than not getting in the boat. And the reason for that is because if you're age 25 and you remain in, say, West Africa, you can expect to live another 42 years. So 1% risk of death sort of today means that averages out to 5 months. But if you make it to Western Europe, the average Western European can expect to live another 55 years. Now, the migrants probably don't get all of that, but the gap in life expectancy is so big that even though there's a 1% chance of dying in the next few hours, your life expectancy goes up by taking that risk. So that is just one way of how extreme the inequality that we're faced with. And I think this migration policy saying no, that is especially hard for progressives. And it should be. Because the benefits to migrants from migration is a very strong reason to try to be open to migration, just how much it can transform people's lives. And so then choosing who to say yes to and who to say no to involves very difficult and uncomfortable trade-offs. And I think there's one thing I feel is that that's so uncomfortable that there's sort of a tendency, probably understandable, to pretend that we don't have to take any of these hard decisions. But I think actually, I'm afraid that we do. We do need to focus on who we should say yes to, who we should say no to, and to understand that all that migration does is just about people. It's just changing the size of your population and the mix of your population. That's all ultimately migration does. It doesn't do any more or anything less. And in doing this, in choosing how we want the size of our population to change, the mix of our population to change, we need to understand, all the sort of trade-offs involved, and there normally are trade-offs. And, that's very complicated. And in this talk, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to desperately try and advertise the book at every possible opportunity in a very embarrassing way. But you have to read the book. So the book sort of talks about, the impact of different types of migrants is different. The different on different types of locals is different. Different on different outcomes is different, on demography, on the economy, on the labour market price, goes on and on. So the book tries to do all of that. I think we should try not to forget that ultimately, in the end, we're interested in how migration affects people's lives. So don't think about migration is good for the economy or something like that. The economy is not a thing that we sort of worship. We need to think how migration actually affects people's lives. So I'm going to discuss a few areas of migration policy. Just because in the interest of time. I'm going to talk about one area that I think is relatively easy, which is higher skilled work migration. One issue that I think is a bit harder, which is lower skilled work migration. And one part that is really hard, the hardest part, which is around asylum seekers and refugees. And I'm going to sort of give you my views. I'm going to try and explain the trade-offs as I see them. But I think because there are trade-offs, reasonable people may come on at the end of the day on different sides. For higher skilled work migration, I think policy is quite easy, which is generally that we should be very open to it. And many countries often are at the moment. And there are two fundamental reasons for that. It raises the skill levels of the economy. So the prosperity of our country depends in large part on the level of what economists would call human capital, the skills of its people. That's why we're telling our, young people, get yourself an education, get skills, because we think this is the way to prosperity. So I think we want a migration policy that aligns with that rather than goes against that. So that's one reason. And secondly, that they're generally going to be fiscally positive. So over their lifetime, they're going to pay more in taxes than they're going to receive in benefits. And that's going to be to the net benefit of the locals. So skilled migration is really kind of easy, but that, as we've seen, that isn't the type of migration that voters really worry about. So what about kind of lower skilled work migration? So here there's a common argument that, well, we need migrant workers to address the problems of labour shortages. And I want to, when I was on that committee in the UK, that was an argument that was often put forward by business lobby groups, essentially. Now, a shortage of workers, I think it's useful to think, can occur for two reasons. The first is that there are not enough people in your country who are able to do the job. That's what we might call a skill shortage. So if you want more doctors fast, takes years and years to train doctors, you're going to have to use migration gives you a way to have more doctors quickly. But the other reason that you can get shortages is that there are plenty of people in the country who are able to do the job. They just don't want to do the job. And the reason for that, I think, is very simple. It's always poor pay and conditions. And, the sectors that are, affected by that are kind of quite similar across countries: agriculture, hospitality, caring, sometimes construction, and so on. And I came to the view on this committee that in those sectors, the cause is always poor pay and conditions, but also that you will never hear employers tell you that. They will always say it's skill shortages. No employer is going to come to you and say, well, we need to be provided with migrant workers because our pay and conditions are so awful. That just isn't going to happen. And I came also to the view that business lobbying has been a major problem in this area. And so one of the ways to make migration policy better is to be a bit more critical of business. So I want to say a little bit more about that. So businesses obviously lobby for many policies. They typically want lower taxes, weaker regulation, a whole list of things. And normally when they lobby for those things, there's pushback from progressives saying, no, we need higher taxes for public services, we need protections of workers, and so on. But on migration, when the businesses are lobbying for more liberal migration rules, there isn't really that pushback. And I think the reason for that is that, understandably, you're worried that if you push back on that, you risk being coming across and seem to criticize the migrants themselves as individuals. And I think that has meant that failure to push back on business has been a sort of a weakness in many countries. And one way of putting it is, suppose a business comes to you and says, well, they're short of customers. We probably would think, well, perhaps your product's a bit rubbish or your price is too high. Probably no one ever says it's the job of the government to provide you with customers. But if a business comes along and says, I'm short of workers, do we ever, lots of people say, yeah, of course we're going to provide you with workers at terms and conditions that you judge appropriate. And I think that asymmetry is just wrong. So we've been sort of too kind to business. So how does that work out for lower skill migration? So if, for example, you allow sort of work visas in sort of lower skilled roles where the fundamental problem is poor pay and conditions, what happens is that those sectors detach from the rest of the labour market, become increasingly dependent on migrant labour. And, you may say that's sort of fine, but and I think this certainly would be the progressive position, that you want to offer these migrant workers a path to permanent residence and eventual citizenship. What's then going to happen is that, say, when they get permanent residence, they're going to be free to change jobs. And they will. For the same reason the locals quit these sectors, poor pay and conditions. So a long history of examples, for example, the Canadian caregiver visa. You have a visa, you issue large number of visas for people to come and care for old people. And you look 5-10 years later and you only find 10-15% of those people are still working in care, because they've quit for the exact same reason the locals quit. There are better jobs on working in the supermarkets. And then also when they get permanent residence, they'll have access to the welfare states. And if they remain low paid, you may well receive more in benefits than you pay in taxes. So what is an effective way to provide cheap labor in the short run actually turns out to be much more expensive in the longer run. And if you look at countries that use lower skilled work migration a lot, places like the Gulf, Dubai or Singapore, they don't offer workers routes out of the sector or a path to becoming a full member of society. They keep them trapped with poor paying conditions in those sectors for as long as they remain in the country. And this leads, I think, to an idea which I think is quite important. Was not my idea, which is two other sort of migration scholars, Martin and Roos, the numbers versus rights trade-off. Then, they basically say, if you offer to migrants a path to settlement and citizenship, so that's more rights, then you will be pushed to be more restrictive in who you admit, lower, in terms of lower, and that means lower numbers, to ensure that there are benefits to locals. Whereas if you keep the migrants as second-class members of society, then you can have higher numbers, and that will be the sort of Dubai, Singapore model. But high numbers and full rights simultaneously is not a combination that's going to work, because the fiscal and political costs are going to be too high to maintain public support. And so you've got to make a choice. And that choice that's one of these very uncomfortable choices for progressives. So what I've called the sort of progressive quandary elsewhere. Okay, let me now sort of move on to what I think is the, probably the most difficult bit, which is sort of asylum seekers, refugee, humanitarian migration. I think it's the most difficult part because I think it's the part where the public think control has been lost the most and they want control. But it's also the part where it's hardest to deliver that control. So this just shows you probably know all this, asylum seekers to the EU. So this big spike in 2015, then another spike in sort of at the end of the pandemic, but coming down more recently, but still at levels that were very high by historical standards of 20 years ago. Why do numbers matter? Numbers are a problem because in most European countries, the labour market outcomes for refugees are very poor. They have very low employment rates and they have low incomes when in employment. And, there's some sort of simple reasons for that. Many of them have not got high levels of education. Often their education have been disrupted because the countries they're coming from. They often got various sorts of trauma. So they got, often would have mental health issues and so on. But the consequence of that is that refugees almost certainly on average are a net burden on the taxpayer. So I've not seen a really good estimate for Europe actually, but Australia has quite a good estimate, I think. And they estimate the lifetime cost of a refugee as being around 250,000 euros a person, lifetime cost. And Australia's outcomes for refugees' labour market are quite similar to Europe. So I would think it's that kind of number. So the first problem is that, refugees are put pressure on public finances. The second problem is that only a fraction of those whose claims are refused actually leave the country. So it's proved very difficult to return people to countries once their claims have been approved. And so then they become part of the unauthorized population. And as we've seen, public, again, I think not that unsurprisingly, they want to have control. And so they don't like the ideas of large unauthorized populations. Having said that, there are very high levels of support for the principle of humanitarian migration. So this is from a poll that was done a year ago. Actually, it was World Refugee Day on Saturday. And normally there was an annual poll comes out on attitudes to asylum seekers and refugees, which I haven't managed to find one for this year. So this is last year's. It's probably exactly the same. So there are very high levels of support for the principle of humanitarian migration. So large majorities in pretty much every country support the principle that people should be able to take refuge in other countries, including in my country. to escape from war persecution. But they are more concerned about they do have concerns about the practice, how this actually works out. They worry about numbers. So you have actually normally minorities, but large minorities for a very extreme policy, saying we must close our borders to refugees entirely. And again, very similar across countries. They worry about whether claims are genuine. You have quite large majorities feeling that the people claiming asylum aren't really refugees, just want to come here for economic reasons or take advantage of welfare services. So I think the principle there's clear public support for is about the practice that is more problematic. So now my feeling is that many of the proposed policies from the anti and pro groups are unconvincing. So on the other side, on the sort of populist right, you would have a policy of saying, well, we're just going to detain and deport everybody that we don't want. And then on the sort of other side, you would have people saying, well, we need either more safe and legal routes, either humanitarian or for other purposes normally work. And then there are ideas around offshore processing as well. So I'll just try and talk briefly about those because I'll try and not take up too much time. So the fact that detain and deport isn't going to work, we know that's not going to work because we just have to look across the Atlantic at the moment. Because what we've seen is just the most enormous increase in the budget for immigration enforcement. You can see that in that top panel on the right-hand side. You've got sort of ICE who just look to me like badly trained, heavily armed, masked paramilitaries sort of wandering around, killing people, picking people up with little regard for due process. So, you know, if they pick you up and you say, no, I'm legally entitled to be here, well, that may or may not save you. And even after all of that, with all of that, Trump is nowhere near his targets for deportations, nowhere near. They are higher, as you can sort of see on the graph in that zone. But I mean, he was promising something like, you know, 1 million a year, I think. He's going to be nowhere near that, even with everything that he has done. So that just isn't a policy that's going to work. What about on the other stream, safe and legal routes? So it's certainly true that people make dangerous, unauthorized journeys because they don't have safe and legal routes. So Ukrainians have had safe and legal routes. They don't make dangerous journeys to reach places of safety. But there is a concern about safe and legal routes, and that's about how numbers will be controlled. So if you have a very restrictive eligibility, for example, cap the numbers who can come on these routes, if you're not selected for one of those routes, well, you're probably still going to make an unauthorized journey. Why wouldn't you? On the other hand, if you have very wide eligibility, then numbers may increase a lot. And so I don't think, you know, I think these are also not without their issues. And I don't really think one idea that's quite popular is that larger work migration programs are going to make much difference. And I don't think really that's going to be true. What does seem to work, I think historically, agreements with countries of immediate departure on returns work. So this would be the Australia-Indonesia sort of deal, something more like along the lines of the EU-Turkey deal. And I'll sort of try and go a bit quicker on this. What I don't think will work will be, which has been sort of in the news lately, are being return hubs. So basically offshore facilities where you're going to, I mean, they're variants of these proposals, but where rejected asylum seekers would be detained pending deportation. I think that could possibly look like it was working in the short run. I don't think that's going to work in the long run. And I think it historically has never worked because agreements with third countries have always had, and always I suspect will have, capacity limits that are quickly reached. After that, they lose any disincentive effect once you can't actually send any more people to them. You very easily, as Australia had large numbers in these facilities for long periods of time with sort of suicide, self-harm. There's essentially an indefinite sort of sentence. Australia offshore processing, often cited as a model, but actually I don't think that's actually what worked there. I think it was actually their agreement with Indonesia to turn back people who were crossing. So I'm actually extremely negative on the prospect of return hubs as a policy. I'll just say very quickly, and I don't know because I haven't talked about this, is about what about sort of community and integration about migrants once they're here. I think, you know, we do face some threats from extremism, sort of Islamism, white nationalism, but actually people are far more united and have far more in common with each other than the things that divide people. So, you know, on the right-hand side here, this is just attitudes to gay rights, basically, in Western Europe. Among non-Muslims, very supportive. Muslims are more socially conservative. That is true. But it's still the case that something like 2/3 of Muslims who are born in Europe, which we'll call Muslim locals, agree that gay men and lesbians should be free to live their own life as they wish. So they are more socially conservative, but we also have older workers, Eastern Europeans, you know, some Christians actually have quite negative views on gay rights. So this is not really, we have a divergence of opinion, but it's not existential. And so on. So I think we need to have a very robust defense of communities that are here. And, you know, that the accusations made against them are often very unfounded. Okay, I'll just finish very quickly, which is more your strategy, is about how you should political response to voter anxiety. There are basically 3 strategies that political scientists talk about here, which is ignore. So you either ignore immigration when people are talking about immigration, or you change the subject to something else. You either accommodate, which you sort of introduce policies to responding to concerns, to trying to change what people get, if you like, or you oppose, you try to change what people want. For example, argue there are big economic benefits from migration. I think ignore is not really an option. I mean, Biden, whether by accident or design, tried that in the US, and it was a total disaster. You know, so Trump, one of the big issues that Trump had over Harris in the 24 election was on immigration. So I don't think ignore is an option. So it's really accommodate or oppose. Now, in academia, it's quite popular to argue the evidence suggests that accommodation doesn't work. But I must say, I don't think that evidence is particularly convincing. I don't think that means that accommodate is the better policy. I think probably we need to be a bit smart to recognize not all migration is the same. We need to be in favor of some controls, but oppose others, and so on. So I think immigration policy is hard, but we can do better. And I think I should probably just stop there to allow some time for discussions. So thank you very much. I've listed a quick summary here, and if you want to know a bit more, I'm afraid I couldn't resist putting at the end, buy the book at the end. I'm sorry about that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have seen you skipped some of your sentence, so probably we might maybe come to these points also in the debate. But thank you for this very interesting issue. So as you can see, also we did not choose the option ignore, otherwise we would not have this debate here. So we have now an invitation-only discussion with our officials as introduced before. So the first response will be Birgit.
Thank you very much. And I did not prepare a speech, but wanted to react. So I might not be able to present a clear line in my reaction. But nevertheless, I think I can mention some points and react on your first ideas or proposals. When talking about the different views that we have, especially in these days, on if migration is positive or negative, I think it's also true that this has a very long history. And we always had people who were totally opposing any kind of migration. And on the other side, we had people say, oh, migration is always positive. It's enriching us. So totally different points. And we never found a good level. And that's what you explained also in the beginning, to differentiate. Whom are we talking about precisely? Is really everything only positive or only negative? And in the current debate, we are not even making differences between the question, whom are we talking about? We have a high number of legal migration. We don't care. But even in the so-called irregular migration, we have different people. We have asylum seekers, but those who are arriving irregularly. Some of them are simply looking for a better future. You explained it. Are we differentiating enough in this area? And maybe already taken on board something that you mentioned in the end, that the question if gay people should live wherever they want and lead the life they want, that in the Muslim community this is different. But maybe this is there because we always have been very bad in really working on integration and inclusion. And we see it. We like Chinatown in the US. If we go to California, we don't like Turkish Town in Berlin. So we make a difference, but we create these kind of special areas for some groups of people. And I had a uncle in the United States, and he told me long years ago, when he arrived, he was surrounded only by German people. For many years, he only talked German language. When he went to the US, he was 15. It was in the 1930s. So he wasn't even aware that he is in another country where most of the people are talking another language. So if you grow up in such an area, and that's very often happening, you stick even more to the country, to culture, traditions you are coming from. And you don't live through that much some other things. So maybe that's also one of the problems. In the meantime, we see that irregular migration for many people with the far right using this for their policies, and the far right always need hate and to split society to present their ideas and become stronger. And irregular migration for many citizens in the meantime means it's irregular, so it's illegal. And even the Commission in the meantime is talking about illegal migration, and illegal for many means it's criminal. So we are fueling bad visions about migration. Talking about, oh, we don't have problems with doctors and high qualified people. And we have many policies trying to say, okay, we want to welcome high qualified people. That might be okay for businesses, but there are two problems. If then we allow also some lower qualified people, whatever that means, high and low qualified people, it seems we have a problem with lower qualified people, and we don't want to accept them. And the other side, and you mentioned it on the businesses want to avoid the cost for qualifying people themselves. That's why they ask, please deliver us, dear government, deliver us the already qualified people. But that means we are exploiting third countries. It's not only the brain drain. We also want them to pay the cost for qualification, and then we take over their people. Is that a good solution? And I think it's not even sustainable. So we have a problem in that. And we also have to see how we get a better angle over there. You mentioned the question that people, even with the safe and legal ways to arrive in Europe, maybe numbers of so-called irregular migration may not go down. Nevertheless, I think in the past years, that's my personal impression, we were not really trying to find out how can we, first of all, better divide the question who is really in need of asylum and who is simply looking for a better future. And what are we doing with those who are simply looking for a better future? So first would be to have agreements with countries of origin. It may not always be easy, but now we opened the door for a number of third countries who are deemed safe. We talked about the return hubs. And just in addition to what we have seen last week in plenary, where the fascists, I'm sorry to call it like that, together with smiling faces from conservatives, were not only massively celebrating what they believe, and they wanted to send a signal that they made it, that their wishes are becoming true. Before that, there was a ministerial conference where my impression was that most of the member states and even agencies were of the same belief as you said. They were not thinking that the return hubs will become a big thing, at least not in short terms. I don't know if this may change now. So I think I don't have a concrete answer how we can change, but I think we have to better differentiate. We have to see what is a sustainable solution. And I'm a little bit tired to hear the Commission always saying we have to talk about solutions that are of mutual beneficiary when talking with third countries. I don't see that we are really interested in mutual beneficial. Talking about return hubs, it only means we want to pay you money, you take everybody back, and then we forget about it. And we don't care if this is good for your development, for the economic situation, we don't care. So I think mutual beneficiary would be one part of the question. Real integration could also be helpful to make people part, avoid to create ghettos in cities. So not to have big areas for incoming migrants, but to a little bit displace them in different areas. And we also have to do something which is the most difficult thing, because we allowed for too much time that our societies are split. At least that's the feeling of many citizens. We are supporting migrants. We are supporting LGBTI. We are supporting Roma people. But who is caring for me? So we are dividing our society in different silos. And I think the biggest challenge is to bring all these people together, because a divided society is a weak society, is a society that might forget protecting values, protecting democracy. So how do we bring all these people together to understand there is an interest from far right capitalist actors, because the far right people are often very capitalistic, so to protect the high level income much more than other parties that we have. So how can we bring people together? And one point that you mentioned is that in general people are ready to protect people, but for that it's not only the question of control, it's that we have to show what it means, how we are ensuring that we are protecting people that are in need of protection. What are we doing with those who are arriving without a right? Can we create new ways to open our market? And I think a last point that I would like to mention is how to deal with business interests. You mentioned the fact that many people who don't have a positive result from their asylum procedure nevertheless stay for different reasons. And many of them receive very low paid jobs. They are exploited. And I remember maybe 5 years ago, I have seen. Okay.
Said something you shouldn't have done.
Maybe yesterday in the area where my office is, we had a total collapse in electricity. Today we had this. So let's see. Where was I ending up in talking about? Now I missed the point. The low paid people. So instead of agreeing to the business, please bring us people. And if we do controls in construction areas, in many areas, and no, I was ending with Belgium, the example. I saw big posters in Belgium maybe 5 years ago where they said, please think about it. If you go to a restaurant, and I think the message was, be kind to the people, because they may be exploited. They may be forced to work 7 days a week. They may not have an own flat. They may be forced to live and sleep in the kitchen. And I was wondering, but I should be alerted about that. So we know that people are exploited, but we let it go. It's good for the business, but it's not good for the migrants. and it's not good for our own citizens who are not feel panic for the migrants, but they fear, oh, if they can do the job under so bad conditions, what does it mean for me and my job and the perspectives of my children? So we have to go against that. And that means we also have to get into trouble with the business side. So they should be sanctioned, and not only to keep the migrants out of the job, send them back if that's possible, but really increase also the sanctions for the business model. So I think there are many things we have to do together with third countries, together with our society on integration and showing why integration and bringing different groups of people together is in the mid and long term a positive thing for strengthening a society that is offering chances for everybody. And I think that's something that needs our focus, to be very precise, to present a progressive answer, but not shy away from the very difficult question that maybe we cannot simply allow everybody in the world who is willing to have a better life to arrive and stay in Europe. So to have clear rules without going into the direction that we saw last week in plenary, because some actors are willing to totally avoid any kind of migration. And I think it's also important to clarify that most of the people coming from third countries today living in Europe, they arrived legally. So the fear that the number of irregulars are too high and they are making the mess, I think maybe that's only due to the way we are dealing with them. And that's also something we have to look at very critical. So I may have extended my 2 minutes. I don't even know if I had 2 or 5 minutes, but these are my first thoughts. Thank you for your presentation.
Five to seven would be manageable. Ellen to be done. So, Mary.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me then focus maybe on the last bit where Birgit ended, which is the business model of cheap labor and migration. Because I do think you mentioned, Alan, the three types: the high skilled, the lower skilled, and the asylum or maybe undocumented migrants. And the last bit is the smallest bit in numbers. The high skilled is also not so large in numbers, and the low skilled is the largest part in numbers. And when we talk about this, it's of course the cause of this is economic, but the debate is always social cultural. And people want lower migration because of probably social cultural ideas, but they do want their tomatoes to be very cheap, and they do want the package to be delivered tomorrow at 12, as they have requested. So this is, I think, the economy that we're living in, and also the way that we are looking at it from our personal view, but in the societies. But I think we have to also look at the way in which businesses work and the way in which businesses thrive or try to thrive on this cheap labor. And the very cheap labor also, if I look, I'm from the Netherlands. So in my country, the number of labor migrants has exploded in the last 5 to 10 years. And when I say exploded, I really mean there's more than a million that has come. When the beginning of this century, we had approximately 15 million inhabitants. Now we're already at 18 million, and we're still growing. And this growth is only because of migration. Even though we have a very fierce debate against asylum migration, but the growth is because of this labor migration and this cheap labor migration. And you see that there are certain sectors that are growing in our country. We want to be a country of high tech, of services industries, of knowledge industries, but we see that the industries that are growing the fastest and that have the most also need of labor are actually transport, agriculture, the hospitality sectors, all these sectors that thrive with cheap labor. And although it irritates me when I go in The Hague to my bakery across the corner and nobody speaks Dutch to me, I do understand that apparently this is the way that it works. And I think here we need to start looking at how this business model has developed. And here I think, Ellen, what you said, when companies want to sell their product and it doesn't sell, maybe the product is not very good, but when they don't have any labor, they want the government to facilitate how this labor, cheap labor, can come to our countries. I think here we really see some elements that also have to do with the way in which we have organized the internal market here in the European Union, and also some elements that are very typical for my own country. I live in the city of The Hague, and the city of The Hague has, I learned it last week because I was on a visit with one of our older men, has 1,867 intermediary agencies. So job agencies that help people to come and work in these sectors, transport, agriculture, and so on. And these numbers of intermediaries, they're growing because this is also the sector that earns a lot of money. And this is the sector that has a lot of lobbying power also towards the government. And every time when we want to see if we can restrict this, if we can do this different, we see that there's all these lobby activities taking place towards our government. And then, no, okay, we don't try to make this somehow to organize this in a better way. Because what we see is, I do understand that there's always a discussion about people that come to Europe, but here we also have the element of people that are being brought to Europe, people that are being asked to come to the Netherlands. These agencies, they often have their little vans that go, much of this labor migration is legal because it's from inside the European Union, but some of it is also from outside of the European Union. And they're just organized, they come from, they go to areas in countries where people have very bad chances on the labor market, and they tell them, if you sign today, by Wednesday morning, you will be working here and here in the Netherlands, and you will be having this job. And they have this job for a couple of months, and then they need to leave because this is when the legality starts. If you stay longer, then you have more rights, then you have more residency rights, more citizens' rights, more social rights. And of course, these companies, they know exactly where the limit is, and they do not want to facilitate this. So I think here we see, at least in this part of Europe, I think also Belgium probably has comparable difficulties. Germany has comparable challenges. But I think my country, unfortunately, is the winner when it comes to the flexible labor market, and the labor market with really cheap labor that comes from inside the European Union and outside of the European Union. And at the same time, the only thing we do is we discuss about asylum seekers. And this is where I really I have this problem, and I'm trying to find the solution and also the answer to change the debate, because you rightfully say that the debate is often about two things: either you have less migrants or you do it legally. But I think all these legal pathways that companies use, not necessarily migrants use, but companies use, are actually the ones that are disrupting the balance in our societies and in our countries. Also because these people, they live under very poor conditions. I think we all know the stories. Last week, again, I heard the stories of houses where people pay the rent to stay in their bed for 8 hours, and then the other 8 hours is the next person and the next person. This is all exploitation, which is organized, and we know it. We know it's there. But again, if we start to debate it, people do want their cheap tomatoes, and they do want their package to be delivered in the next morning. So I think what we have to do is work on these intermediaries, not only on the abuse of the intermediaries, but also on the fact that they can organize this the way in which they are organizing it, but also work on subcontracting, because there's often subcontracting in a number of sectors where you have 3, 4, 5 or more layers, and people don't know where to go if they have a problem in their with whatever, if they're not being paid enough or if there's unsafe circumstances. So we really should see if we can bring this down. This is something that we have tried. But first and foremost, I think it starts with what you said, Ellen, in the beginning, is the labor conditions, the salary and the conditions of these kind of jobs are not the jobs that local people want to have. And apparently, we think then that it's okay that we bring in not just one or two, but literally hundreds of thousands of people from outside to do this kind of work. So there's, I think, already part of the solution is that we try to force these companies also to start and pay a normal wage, because also often on paper it's a minimum wage, but then in practice it's much less because there's all kinds of constructions around it, which also means that you really need very strong labor authorities and inspections to look at what is happening around there. I think there's lots of possibilities to try and improve it. Also because I really think that we need to change this debate and counter it. We are talking about migrants that are being the problem, that are, the social cultural imbalance in our countries is caused by large numbers of migrants, but it's actually caused by these companies that use these people. Thank you.
Thank you. With us. So also we will be happy to maybe. Perfect.
Thank you, Andreas. And thank you, Professor Manning. I certainly didn't come with a speech ready to deliver. I'm not intending to. But the thing is that there is a fair question here that is most challenging: how progressives should think about migration. And the only short answer is that we should think otherwise, as compared to the prevailing view and understanding and rhetoric and politics, which are being now prevailing in the winning side at a European scale in all of the European institutions, including the European Parliament. We should think otherwise. To begin with, we should be more efficient in telling the difference between migration and asylum. It's a fact that it's a kind of a syntagm. It goes together. Even in the treaties, migration and asylum, they're always together, linked, but they are different things. Asylum is a right, migration is a fact. It's always been. It's a constant in human history. Whereas asylum as a right is very recent, actually, in history. It came about right after Second World War with the Geneva Convention 1951, and because of Second World War. But still, it's binding law for all of the member states, because the Geneva Convention is binding law for all the member states, and besides, it's a source of EU law. Article 21 of the Treaty of the European Union makes it a source of EU law, international law, which includes human rights and humanitarian law, including the Geneva Convention. But still, they always go together, and we have a hard time to make the difference. Second, when it comes to migration, telling the difference between asylum seekers, which do have a right to seek protection, and we have a duty to protect them, it doesn't mean that migrants are actually the kind of fake alternative to asylum seeking. Migrants are not criminals. Migrants are not the bad guys. I mean, if asylum seekers deserve respect, so do migrants. The difference between asylum seekers and migrants does not mean that migrants are to be rejected, where asylum seekers should be respected. Also, migrants are human beings to be respected. Besides, we progressives should actually be much more efficient and bold, daring, when it comes to making the case for migration as a contribution to EU social fabric and prosperity. But the thing is that we fail utterly and sadly. Take Spain. It happens to be the only country in the in the council, around the council table, which is trying to make the case for a positive view about migrants. Migrants are not an invasion; it's not out of control. Actually, if you handle it, you can actually make it a source of prosperity for your own sake, for your own good. But you know what? Just this latest Council of the European Union, Pedro Sanchez was scorned by everybody around, was harassed by everybody around. And that's the way the Spanish press has interpreted. Poor Pedro Sanchez, he's taken the blow. Everyone was finger pointing at him. What are you doing? What are you doing? Are you exporting your migrants all across the Schengen area? Are you out of your mind or what? Are you insane or what? That is the kind of narrative that the Spanish press has transported about Pedro Sanchez in the latest council, because he was the only one to oppose return regulation, the only one to oppose return regulation. Maybe some other made a shade, a nuance, maybe some other maybe abstained in this or that, but the only one to oppose it was Pedro Sanchez, and he was not in the winning side. He was taking the blow because of it. And he was saying, hey, listen, take Spain. It's the number one economy, growing economy in the European Union. 4 times Germany, 4 times France, 4 times Italy. We are the number one job creator in the European Union. 5 out of every 10 jobs, I mean, 1 of 2 jobs in the European Union is created in Spain. And we are growing in population, and we're growing in economy, and we're showing that including migrants can be good for your economy and for your social balance, but still not in the winning side. Still not in the winning side. I mean, the prevailing narrative is the contrary. They're invading us and they are out of control. We should actually exploit our brains, blow our brains, in order to seek a way out from this conundrum, from this spell, because we gotta sort it out. How progressives should think about migration? It's not an invasion. They are not a threat. They are not criminals. The difference between asylum seekers and migrants does not make migrants the bad guys. They also have a right to seek for opportunities. When then there comes, of course, the point of all challenges that are linked to handling migration. The idea was that it should be European. Well, we have seen the latest development, this mandate of the European Parliament, which is the one defining where we are now. The return regulation is not only wrong because of its choices, it's wrong because of the concept behind, which is returning to the member states a power and competences and choices that should be European. The return regulation means that anyone is free to negotiate with some third country ruler a return hub for the sake of paying money to that ruler. For the exchange of money to that ruler, any country is free now to spend or to invest national budget into financing a return hub abroad. That is the contrary of the European scale of response. That is returning to the member states a choice that should be European, not national any longer. So the thing is that we have a huge challenge here, and maybe I can only add that as to this challenge of thinking a progressive way about migration, we should insist more effectively that we are not here to follow the worst instincts of our voters, but somehow to shape them, to lead them, if you will, to educate them. Because of course I take the blow time and again that, have you heard about your constituents? They are concerned about migration. It's the number one priority. Of course, it's a mix of component elements. The source of that concern is that media are insisting on it. The social nets are distorting the vision. They are fear mongering, and then they exploit the fear they have mongered. First, they create the fear, and then they exploit it electorally. And of course, I cannot be blind to that. I know that many of the progressive voters are also concerned about migration out of control and migration invading or exploiting our resources or predating our social services. Of course, I cannot ignore that. but still we have a duty to somehow shape our voters and tell them it's not true. It's never been true that your grandmother is being denied a fair pension because a migrant is having an incredible, huge benefit just for the sake of setting foot on your shore. That's never been true. We should actually combine forces in order to not to indulge or to concede our voters' worst instincts, rather than trying to shape them and educate them and spread some kind of an alternative view and narrative on the matter. And I don't want to be pessimistic, but the thing is that in this mandate of the European Parliament, the European Union in all is damaging its own interests with a self-damaging strategy, with a self-defeating strategy. We are losing population, we're losing weight, we are diminishing our weight and stature in the world, and still we are rejecting them. And the message here is there are incentives to send them back, which is the far right cry in the latest plenary in Strasbourg, to send them back. That is the landscape now. Do we have a chance to change it, or or are we laying down arms and saying, hey, we're defeated, there's little we can do about it? That is the way people think. If we want them to support us and vote for us, then we might rather ignore it or rather go along or surf that tide. Is that our choice? Then that, in my view, I cannot help it. I can't help but insisting on it. In my view, that's self-defeating, particularly for us social democrats. That is self-defeating for us social democrats, and that can only be detrimental to our expectations. So we need to combine forces in order to change this thing, which is so hard to bear. Okay, I'm sorry not to be more optimistic, but the landscape is pretty discouraging when it comes to assessing facts as they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Fernando. And first of all, Ellen, whenever you want to sneak in, you have the privileged position. Of course, you can always come in, because
I mean, I was maybe going to collate and try to organise, probably not very successfully, comments at the end. But.
Perfect. Okay, then Pascal.
Thank you. Thank you for being here for a double reason. I live in Brussels, and many of you might know that it's a very immigration-based city. I think like 70% of the people in the city are foreign-born or having parents that are foreign-born. So migration is a real topic, although most of you will consider you like expats. I'll come back to that later. The difference is not innocent between expats and migrants. We'll come back to that. But I'm here as a member of the Brussels Regional Parliament, International Secretary of FEPS, but I've also been 20-year minister in different governments in Belgium. And most importantly, I think for a couple of years, ran the migration and asylum policies and system in Belgium like 20 years ago. And one of the things that, and maybe say, Alan, I wrote your book this weekend, so I bought it with Apple Library, and I just wrote it. It's well written, and I'm very happy that you explained how thing is about the polarized debate, the binary debate, but also the anecdotal debate. Very often, if you talk about migration, people will base their opinions on anecdotes, and was a little bit here too. And it's very true what you've written to, and also what you said about shaping policies. I think that's why we are social democrats, but because we believe that you can make society. So otherwise, we would belong to another party. But that being said, if I look back to the time that I was managing asylum and migration in Belgium, and the debates that we were having then, it's just exactly the same what we're having doing today. And so it is completely crazy to see that like 25 years, we have been talking about more European solidarity, taking from Spain, from Italy and Greece away the whole pressure of the unauthorized migration, that we were talking already then about return hubs. We were already talking then to, do we have to process asylum claims at the border of the European Union? We have to speed up the asylum procedures, difficulties with reception. Are we going to allow people to work, yes or no? So the issues that were on the table like 20, 25 years ago are still today on the table. And so people who follow a little bit politics will say, what the hell have they been doing the last 20 years? And that's, for me, the basic problem in whole the migration debate, is that basically people are not against other people. They are not against migration. But when they have the perception that it is no longer under control, then they have a problem. And all these governments, and the UK government is the most beautiful example of that, are always every day saying, we don't have it under control. We have to take more measures. We don't have it under control. And so you're basically putting yourself as a policymaker or a government responsible fear into society, combined with the fact that migration is more visible in the streets. Look this city, look other cities, even on the countryside. To stay in Belgium, Ostend, it's near there, you know where it is, I guess. Full of people with immigrant backgrounds. Even my parents are saying now, and they are okay people, and they are saying, what is this? Because then often sometimes things happen and they are making associations. So it becomes more visible. And I think a lot of people are feeling sometimes, rightly or unrightly, but it's perception that you're alienated. You live in a street, and then a couple of years later, the whole street changed. You didn't move, and all of a sudden you're living in another thing. And they were not prepared to do so. So the combination of governments that are sending the signal that it's out of control and they don't have it under control again, and by seeing it factually in your own street, gives a feel of unease with people. And then when you address this unease of people with kind of moral standard, oh, you are racist, you don't understand, well, they get angry. And I think that's a kind of thing that is happening today in society. And indeed, we don't have to follow the fear, but we have to be, empathetic. They have to be understandable for the fear. And then you have to talk with people. So that's the first remark I would like to make, is that the perception of the fact that it's out of control is not true. The day that people think again you have it under control, then their attitude will change. But let's be honest, everything is based on asylum seekers. Nobody is talking about international students. Nobody is, sometimes they talk about family unification when it's linked to asylum seekers, but when family unification is linked to other things, it's less problematic. High income, no problem too. And so we have to be honest too, I think, in the debate among us. A lot of people are having problems now with migration because of the origin of people. I mean, you took the example of Spain. I think one of the reasons why you could do in Spain what you have done is that a lot of your immigrants are coming from a Catholic, Spanish-speaking, culturally aligned society. Colombia, Venezuela, all these kind of countries, they are very, I'm not saying similar to Spain, but it's there's a lot of connection out there. But then today, in a world where there is kind of binary thinking about Catholics and Muslims again, a lot of the migration that many European countries are having is Arab migration, whether it is Moroccan, when it's from Tunisia, and then people, very with a headscarf, not always. Then people will say, what is this? We don't really believe, what is this? There's a kind of unease coming too. So we have to be honest about that too. There's the whole question of religion. And of course, what you have mentioned, the question of numbers too, and income. I mean, most people won't have a problem with someone coming living in a country with a high income. But when someone with a low income, all of a sudden it becomes a problem. To give an anecdote, if you're going to live next to the Moroccan ambassador, it won't be a problem. But if you're going to live next to the Moroccan guy who is very poor and have lots of kids, then all of a sudden it becomes a problem for people. It's a little bit like that in our society. I'm not saying it's right, the feeling, but it's the way that people sometimes react. So it is a social issue. It is an issue of background. Coming then, I think, for the public opinion, the most problematic thing today is the asylum seekers. And if you look to I had it once, the asylum office in Belgium. So if you look to the recognition rate, it's pretty low. So that means that a lot of people are using asylum procedures for a way to find a better life. And I absolutely agree that we don't have to criminalize it. There's nothing wrong with people looking for a better life. But on the other hand, as long as you've written in your book too, there is inequality in the world. We cannot go to open borders, and then we have to select and say yes and no who we're going to accept. But I think we have to have a debate. I don't believe in the return hubs, to be quite clear to with everybody. I think it's bullshit. It won't work. It's again a big mistake, because in a couple of years people will see it won't work, and then they will get crazy again, because you were saying we're going to take a tough measure, and then the tough measure doesn't work. What are they going to do then? To choose even tougher measures. So what are they going to do next time? Shoot on people? Huh? I hope not, but some people are probably ready to do so. So it is something very bad, but I think we should have open, and it's very dangerous, but we should think about the Geneva Convention, where initially it was basically most giving protection in the region of origin and not everywhere in the world. And I know it's a little tricky to start to talk about the Geneva Convention, although it is the 67 protocol, I think, who changed everything, and not the convention as such, because it was limited in the beginning to European refugees, and then it was broadened to 67. But that's a question. I mean, if you look to Ukraine, did you hear a lot of people feeling uneasy that we had to give protection to Ukrainian refugees or asylum seekers? No. Because they were considered to be European, they were considered to have reception in the area, and so for a lot of people it was not a difficulty. And so I think we, at least on an intellectual level, we must dare to have the debate. Shouldn't we go to a system where people who need protection should get protection out of their country, but shouldn't it be given in the region of origin? And isn't it then a moral duty of European Union and member states to fund these countries in the region, where often also conflict driven or poor countries, to help them financially to organize that protection in the region? It's a question. Because if you say that, the whole business of people smuggling, because that's a big business, people smuggling, and a lot of people are spending a lot of money to get here, and basically the poor refugee or asylum of refugees who need protection will never come in Europe. Never come. We never say, oh well, never. Some of them will come, but a lot of them are already with money in their country of origin. It's not the poorest one who can pay a business class ticket between brackets, because that's the price they have to pay, and even more to get with traffickers in Europe. So I think there's a question there to have, and not to focus on this return hubs won't work, but maybe protection in the country of the region of origin, supported by the Union, is more effective than what we are doing today. Again, I think two remarks to end. First of all, I think this is a European problem and can only be solved on a European scale. And due to our geographical situation, close to Russia, close to Turkey, close to Africa, it will be always more complicated for Europe to try to control it or create a perception of control, because contrary to Australia, or contrary even to United States, we are not an island. I mean, we are connected with a lot of other parts in the world. So it will be always a European issue. And I understand the people in Spain, I understand the people in Italy, I understand the people in Greece, when they have to take all the pressure. And then the other richest European countries are saying, it's your problem, it's not our problem. Not to say the Danish, because we have to be honest about the Danish too, what they all are doing. So it's pushing away to other ones. It's not a fair thing to do. And finally, we're living in very weird times where trust is more important than truth. And it's also very clear in this item. I don't think that anybody believes that Farage or others will resolve the migration issue, like Wilders in the Netherlands, in your country. I mean, he had all the things to resolve it, but he doesn't want to resolve it, because then his how you say that, his cause to get votes will be gone. So, and it's a little bit the same like that, but people trust them to do it. So the big challenge for progressive is to convince people again that they can trust us, that we will manage the system in a fair way, that it's good for migrants too, because they remain humans, absolutely, but also for local people. And then, in the end, indeed, words matter. And I come back to the experts. It's a very interesting thing why all the people working for European Union institutions in a broad sense of the word are called experts, and everybody who's not doing are called migrants. We have to think about it, about the word choice that we are all doing. So, and I hope one day you become all Brusselaars. To be clear. Thank you.
We just become somehow. Okay, Agnes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Not a lot to add after all these very interesting sort of comments. Thank you very much, Professor Manning, for your presentation. I didn't read your book yet, so I may have missed quite a few things, but I liked your way of sort of qualifying the different types of migrants and sort of considering them sort of separately. I liked as well your insistence on the fact that, I mean, we've got to regulate one way or the other. We've got to make choice and select amongst migrants. If I may, I would like to sort of come back to what I found sort of three zones that you didn't touch on, or maybe not touch on sort of strong enough. The first one is the question of migration diplomacy, which the Commission is very much insisting on. I mean, because all migrants are not economic migrants. And I mean, most people sort of are very reluctant to leave their country, but a lot of them would leave for, I mean, you mentioned homosexuality, forced marriages, etc. So, I mean, there is certainly in this sort of migration diplomacy something to sort of gain from helping people to actually implement the rule of law. When I talk about forced marriages, I mean, there is a lot of, or FGM, a lot of people would, a lot of governments, for instance, in Africa, have now got legislation against it, but it's not implemented, right? And people move and people migrate because they are in this sort of constrained situations. The second one is the fact that with all the wars around, recently the displaced populations have increased tremendously. These displaced populations, for a lot of them, we see it with Iraq, but we see it with Syria a little bit at the moment as well. I mean, a lot of them are sort of due to go back sort of fairly quickly. On top of that, they've not been willing migrants, right? And I think this is an important issue. The third issue is about women in migration. Apart from being a member of the scientific committee of FEPS, I am a member of the Haut Conseil de l'égalité in France, and as a chair of the international and European committee, we're doing a lot of hearings at the moment of NGOs, but as well, international organizations, and a lot of the bodies in France which sort of accept migrants and regulate migrants. We are sort of working on the question of violence against women in the migration voyage from the country of origin to the countries of transit, and even when they arrive. I believe that after having heard a lot of these sometimes very dreadful stories, very emotional, etc., the number of rapes or the number of sort of people sort of caught in impossible situations is dreadful. You've got people who sort of get out of it as well. But I do think that there is fairly little comparatively studies and research on migrant women. And they are now sort of, I think, 51% of in our countries of the migrants. And I do think that not only for, I mean, the fact that they're invisible and they can be they're very often victims, but they can be a resource. I think that the insistence of migrant women would certainly sort of help sort of turn public opinion as well, because it would not be only the stabber of Manchester or whatever. It would be the, I mean, people who sort of contribute to care, who are very often sort of underemployed as compared to their skills, etc. And that would probably turn as well public opinion if we were putting more insistence in the press in particular and politically on them. So that's my 3 comments.